Dylan Thomas, a man who in his time was just as likely to be seen off his face holding court at the corner pub as he was being recognized among England's greatest poet laureates, almost as infamous for his boozing and womanizing ways as he was for the transcendental opera he produced. Despite this, Caitlin Thomas, his wife and lifelong partner, would later protest his evocation in her own book, saying simply that he was easy to seduce. These contrivances for Thomas's character seem to have followed him from a tender age, having lived his youth in the red brick house at 5 Condolcombe Drive, snugly stowed away in the sleepy seaside town of Swanee, Wales. His mother, Florence, was a seamstress known for having mollycoddled the young lad. His father, on the other hand, an English professor at the local Swanee's grammar school for boys who graduated with first-class honors from the University College of Wales, spent many his nights locked in his study, desperate for something greater. Many of Thomas's outlandish later-in-life eccentricities cohere once to the relationship with his parents is coalesced. His feeling towards his father can probably be summed up best by the last stanza of what many consider to be his masterwork.
And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Thomas's onset precarious nature can in part be attributed to the niche group of Swanee's artists he found himself running with in his youth, a group who named themselves the Cardoma Gang. Fellow famous poets such as Verone Watkins, Fred Janes, and the painter Dan Jones, the world-renowned classical composer. The convergence of youth talent is what gave the artists the experience in which they used to sharpen their teeth. Dylan, unlike many of his contemporary bards, wasn't afraid to wear his inspiration on his sleeve, even proudly proclaiming in a letter to a friend later in life that he was the rim bard of Condolcombe Drive. At just 19, Thomas would publish one of his first poems, Light, in a smaller BBC editorial called The Listener. Despite its limited reach, the piece would be noticed by the biggest literary name at the time, T.S. Eliot. He would feel compelled to write the young author.
Light breaks on secret lots, on tips of thought where thoughts smell in the rain. When logics die, the secret of the soil grows through the eye, and blood jumps in the sun. Above the waste allotment, the dawn halts.
Much like Rimbaud, Dylan would end up writing many of his iconic works in his early years. What came next would be something young Thomas would never forget. Despite being deemed unfit to serve, Dylan would find other ways in which to aid the war effort. He scripted 14 propaganda documentaries for the Ministry of Information and produced dozens of on-air programs for the BBC. Although having consistent work was a blessing for the torpid poet, who was now responsible for a family, the calamity stagnated his ability to produce his own art. It wasn't until after the war he published Death and Entrances, which would go on to be his best-selling book of poems by leagues. In it, a particularly devastating poem that sits near the front.
the majesty and burning of the child's death. I shall not murder the mankind of her going with a grave truth, nor blaspheme down the stations of the breath with any further elegy of innocence and youth. Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter, robed in the long friends, the grains beyond age, the dark veins of her mother, secret by the unmourning water of the riding Thames. After the first death, there is no other.
Thomas met his wife Caitlin, a then 22-year-old Irish-French Quaker who ran from home with dreams of being a dancer at the Wheatsheaf pub in London's West End. Having been introduced by Caitlin's then lover, before the night was over, Dylan, with his head in her lap, had already proposed marriage. They wedded in the summer of next year. And though that sentiment seems to swell with romanticism, their relationship wasn't without its hardships, fraught with arguments, infidelity mostly on behalf of Dylan, long bouts of unexplained absence, and not nearly enough money to go around. The couple bore 3 children, the weight of such a burden falling almost entirely on Caitlin's shoulders. This, coupled with the devastating loss of her dreams, would be enough to turn anyone sour. But she maintained their love for years after the poet's death, even writing 4 tomes on their whirlwind romance. Dylan's untimely death would arrive in late 1953, the artist having proudly proclaimed 18 straight whiskeys, I think it's a record, before slipping into a coma that would take him 4 days later. Having complained of trouble breathing just a few days earlier, a renowned celebrity physician, Dr. Milton Feldstein, diagnosed his symptoms as a result of his blatant alcoholism. His prescription of 3 morphine shots was actually what did him in. See, Thomas was actually suffering from consumption of the lungs. Many have gone on to blame the poet's death on the misattributed diagnosis, and though my intent isn't to clear his name, it is my assertion that Dylan's death was indeed a result of his own hubris. Those of whom Dylan knew for an extended time recognized that 2 people lived inside his mind, the performer and the poet. Thomas had a knack for making himself seen. He would break out into coughing fits in order to better portray his image of a romantic poet stricken with tuberculosis. Friends who would bounce between bars and social shivus would recall him announcing upon their arrival that he had drinking twice or even 3 times as much liquor as they knew him to have. It's no doubt that these showboating mannerisms were only amplified during his trip across the pond, a trip in which he was not accompanied by any friends or family, a trip which he bounced around the entire country, performing at colleges, museums, and theaters, a trip that would claim the last few years of his life. Dylan would die the performer, putting on a show desperate to convince himself of what anybody around him already knew, that his poet wasn't yet dead.